In the final years leading up to the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy trained its officers to believe that every shell mattered. Ammunition wasn't just a tool of war. It was a resource so limited that each round had to be accounted for, logged, rationed, and fired, only with deep consideration. Captain Japanese Hara, one of Japan's most respected destroyer commanders, understood this reality better than most. His years at sea taught him that a single miscalculated burst could mean the difference between survival and helplessness. Japan didn't lack courage, discipline, or fighting spirit. What it lacked was something far more decisive: industrial depth. Across the ocean, the United States approached naval warfare from an entirely different universe. American destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were supplied by an industrial machine so gigantic that the men aboard them sometimes took its power for granted. To Japanese officers like Captain Hara, the difference was surreal. He would later say, half in frustration and half in awe, that American gunners seemed to fire shells without thinking, as if they had an endless supply at their fingertips. And in a sense, they did. This difference, Japan counting every round while America fired without hesitation, was not just a tactical contrast. It was the defining gap that shaped nearly every engagement between the two navies. To understand Captain Hara's observation fully, we must begin with the world he came from, a world shaped by shortages, discipline, and constant calculation. As early as the 1930s, Japanese naval planners knew that their empire could not match the United States in production. Japan lacked oil, steel, and industrial capacity. Even when the war began, every shell produced for the Imperial Navy required precious raw materials that Japan struggled to import. The American embargoes that cut off Japan's oil supply in 1941 only sharpened the crisis. Japanese commanders knew that once their stockpiles were exhausted, resupply would not be simple or even possible. So they trained their crews to fight with maximum precision and minimum waste. Destroyer captains like Hara were instructed to think of ammunition as a strategic resource, not just a tactical one. Every shell had a specific purpose. Gunnery officers drilled endlessly to ensure that no round was fired unless it served a clear objective. And during battles, Japanese ships often held fire until they had identified exact ranges and calculated firing solutions with extreme care. Japanese naval culture was built around discipline, accuracy, and the belief that quality could overcome quantity. The United States, meanwhile, embraced the opposite doctrine. American industrial might meant that naval engagements could be approached with overwhelming firepower. Factories in California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and New York were producing shells on a scale the world had never seen. Thousands per day, millions per month. For every shell Japan produced, the United States created dozens. American ships were loaded with more ammunition than their Japanese counterparts could dream of carrying, and more was always available when they returned to port. This difference became painfully visible during the Solomon Islands campaign in 1942 and 1943. The waters off Guadalcanal became a graveyard for ships from both sides, but it was there that Japanese officers witnessed firsthand the astonishing volume of fire American vessels could unleash. Captain Hara described night battles where U.S. destroyers seemed to light up the ocean with near-constant gunfire. To him, American gunners appeared almost careless in their willingness to expend ammunition, firing continuously and adapting rapidly to changing conditions. Whether the target was confirmed or only suspected, American destroyers had no hesitation in saturating the area with shells. For Japanese ships, such firepower was overwhelming. Their doctrine relied on precision strikes, ideally using torpedoes like the feared Type 93 Long Lance. But these weapons were limited in number and impossible to replace quickly. Gun ammunition was similarly precious. Even in intense engagements, Japanese captains often held fire when American ships would have already unleashed dozens of rounds. They had to maintain discipline if they hoped to survive the next encounter. This difference only widened as the war dragged on. American supply lines stretched across the Pacific like a conveyor belt. Enormous fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and floating dry docks ensured that the U.S. Navy could fight continuously, resupplying at sea and returning to battle almost immediately. Meanwhile, each Japanese loss, whether a ship, a convoy, or a factory, pushed the Navy closer to collapse. By 1944, Japan was fighting with dwindling supplies across every major category: shells, torpedoes, aviation gasoline, even spare parts. The industrial gap had become a canyon. But the story isn't just about numbers. It's also about psychology. Japanese officers felt the pressure of scarcity constantly. The crews on their ships were reminded that waste was not just inefficient, it was dangerous, even dishonorable. The concept of counting every round came from decades of naval tradition shaped by limited resources. Officers were responsible for maintaining detailed ammunition logs. Damage to supply ships, delays in transport, and shortages back home made every captain painfully aware of how fragile their situation was. American officers, on the other hand, rarely thought about running out of ammunition. Their ships were designed with deep magazines, and their logistics ensured that new supplies would arrive on schedule. This confidence allowed U.S. forces to adopt aggressive, high-volume fire tactics. Naval gunfire wasn't simply a last resort. It was a tool used freely to shape battles, pin down enemy ships, bombard shore positions, and compensate for uncertain visibility at night. This difference became especially apparent during nighttime engagements. The Americans mastered radar-controlled gunfire earlier and more effectively than Japan. With radar, U.S. ships could detect enemy vessels before they were seen visually, then open fire immediately. The high rate of fire didn't just rely on advanced technology, it relied on the knowledge that they could afford to shoot. Radar-directed volleys often filled the darkness with hundreds of shells before Japanese crews were even aware they had been spotted. Japan did have radar later in the war, but not at the scale and reliability of the United States, and even when radar information was available, Japanese officers were reluctant to waste ammunition on uncertain targets. Every missed volley felt like a strategic defeat, a waste of resources Japan couldn't replenish. Captain Hara saw this contrast repeatedly. His destroyer, Amatsukaze, fought in some of the fiercest naval battles of the Pacific War. He witnessed American destroyers firing with a speed and confidence that seemed almost reckless to Japanese officers. Shells rained across the water in intense bursts, and American gunners appeared to adjust their aim midstream, using volume of fire to bracket targets instead of relying solely on precision. Hara admired the skill, but knew that behind that skill was something more powerful than any tactic: an industrial empire feeding the guns. His remark that Americans used shells without thinking was not an insult. It was an observation born of experience. American gunners were not careless. They were liberated from the constraints that defined Japanese naval warfare. They could fire quickly, aggressively, and repeatedly because they came from a nation that produced more ammunition, more ships, and more material than any other in human history. This reality shaped the fate of the Pacific War. Japan fought bravely, often brilliantly, but always with one hand tied behind its back. The Imperial Navy was a masterpiece of training and discipline, but it could not escape the industrial truth that every shell mattered. And as the war dragged on, that truth became impossible to ignore. For American sailors, the abundance of ammunition meant that naval gunfire could be used to overwhelm defenses, suppress enemy fire, and dominate engagements. Shells rained onto islands before landings, blasted enemy airfields, and pounded Japanese ships before they could close to torpedo range. Japanese destroyers were agile and deadly, but running out of ammunition in the middle of a battle turned them into targets. More than once, Japanese ships were forced to retreat early because their magazines were empty. The Battle of Cape St. George, fought in late 1943, remains one of the clearest examples of this contrast. American destroyers under Captain Arleigh Burke used radar-guided tactics, overwhelming fire, and rapid maneuvering to annihilate a Japanese force. Japanese ships fought fiercely, but were outgunned and outsupplied. When the battle ended, it wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a reminder of the widening gap between the two navies. Captain Hara, looking back on these experiences, understood the painful truth. Japan was not defeated by lack of skill or courage. It was defeated by the crushing weight of American industrial power, and nothing symbolized that more clearly than the way American ships fired their guns, with confidence, speed, and what seemed to Japanese officers like complete disregard for the scarcity that defined their own lives at sea. As the war approached its end, the situation grew even more desperate. Japan's fuel supply collapsed. Factories were bombed into ruin. Convoy ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Ammunition shortages became so severe that some ships were forced to leave port with incomplete magazines. Others had to conserve their shells so strictly that firing drills were cancelled to avoid wasting even a single round. And yet American ships continued firing as if the war would never exhaust their supplies. Landings across the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marianas to the Philippines, were preceded by days of bombardment. Cruisers and battleships poured thousands of shells onto beaches and defensive positions, creating shock waves that Japanese defenders could barely comprehend. Even destroyers were known to empty thousands of rounds in single operations, knowing that resupply was always available. By 1945, the imbalance had become absolute. Japan's fleet was shattered. The survivors lacked ammunition, fuel, and equipment. America, meanwhile, was producing war material in quantities so vast that even historians struggle to express it. The U.S. Navy didn't just win battles. It overwhelmed the enemy with a tidal wave of steel, explosives, and industrial strength. Captain Hara, reflecting after the war, spoke with honesty. He admired the United States for its power, its discipline, and its ability to mass-produce everything a modern navy needed. His remark about ammunition was not simply a complaint. It was a summation of the fundamental truth that Japan could never escape. America fought like a giant because it was a giant. Japan fought with precision because it had no other choice, and that is the human reality behind his words, the reality of men fighting in ships where every shell counted, facing opponents who lived in a world where ammunition seemed limitless. Two navies, two doctrines, two industrial worlds. One forced to measure every round, the other firing without hesitation. The outcome of the war was written in that difference long before the first shot was fired. As the Pacific War raged into its final years, Captain Tameichi Hara and countless frontline Japanese officers witnessed a widening gulf between Japan's fading firepower and America's rising industrial storm. What began as a war of maneuver and surprise had become a relentless contest of endurance, one that Japan was never built to win. And the most brutal proof of this imbalance was seen in the very thing every navy depends on to fight: ammunition. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was forced to ration shells so strictly that ships often sailed with only a portion of their authorized load. Destroyers went into battle with far fewer rounds than their American counterparts fired in a single engagement. Hara later wrote that every time a Japanese gun captain pulled the lanyard, he felt the weight of the nation's dwindling industrial capacity behind that single shell. Every shot mattered. Every shot was counted. Every shot was a reminder that the empire was running out of steel, explosives, fuel, and time. In contrast, the Americans, supported by factories that stretched from Detroit to Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, were firing shells with a confidence that shocked their opponents. To the Japanese, it felt as if the U.S. Navy never stopped shooting. Their destroyers unleashed rapid, continuous fire at ranges that Japanese gunners considered wasteful. But the Americans were not being careless. They were executing a doctrine built on overwhelming fire superiority. Suppress first, hit second, dominate always. Captain Hara would later reflect on this difference with a mix of frustration and awe. Where Japan fired precious shells only when a hit seemed likely, the Americans fired to shape the battle itself. They fired to blind the enemy with splashes. They fired to force enemy maneuvers. They fired to choke off torpedo attacks. Their ammunition was used as a weapon of strategy, not only precision. The disparity was felt most painfully during nighttime engagements, waters where Japanese sailors had once been unmatched. Early in the war, Japanese optics, torpedoes, and night vision training gave them the edge. But by late 1943 and into 1944, American radar gunnery changed everything. Destroyers like the Fletcher class used radar-directed fire to unleash shells before Japanese ships even realized they were being tracked. To Japanese captains, it felt like fighting an enemy who shot in the dark without hesitation and without fear of running out. Shells rained down in patterns wide enough to envelop entire formations. Hara recalled moments in which American fire seemed endless. Broadside after broadside, illumination rounds, star shells, proximity-fused anti-aircraft belts, each one another reminder of industrial power Japan could not match. Meanwhile, aboard Japanese ships, gunnery officers counted remaining shells aloud during battle. Every illumination round fired at the wrong time risked leaving the ship blind later in the fight. Every high-explosive shell used against a screening destroyer meant one less available for the cruisers behind it. The Japanese Navy was forced to fight with a scarcity mindset every single day, while the Americans fought with a doctrine of relentless abundance. By 1945, the situation reached critical levels. Many Japanese Navy vessels sailed with such limited ammunition that they were explicitly instructed to avoid combat unless absolutely necessary. Some ships carried only defensive rounds. Others had shells of mixed quality, different batches, different ages, or even repurposed land-based artillery rounds. The Empire's munitions plants had been bombed, raw materials were scarce, and transport convoys were constantly sunk. And yet, on the other side, America was firing thousands of shells in shore bombardments, suppressing islands before Marines ever stepped foot on them. When Japanese soldiers witnessed pre-landing barrage from U.S. battleships and cruisers, they described it as if the ocean itself had turned into a factory, producing explosions. The shelling simply never seemed to end. It was industrial warfare at a scale the world had never witnessed. This imbalance extended into anti-aircraft warfare. American ships had so much ammunition for their 5-inch guns, Bofors, and Oerlikons that they maintained continuous anti-aircraft barrages for hours during kamikaze waves. Japanese pilots, in their final desperate missions, found themselves flying into clouds of steel, not because of American carelessness, but because American ships always had more shells ready. Hara wrote about these barrages with deep respect. He understood that what Japan labeled American wastefulness was not waste at all. It was the product of a country that had mastered production and logistics to a degree Japan had never imagined. America could fire shells without hesitation because they could replace them faster than Japan could launch a single transport convoy. As the war neared its end, the psychological impact of this firepower became as devastating as the physical. Japanese sailors felt outgunned before battles even began. Every American destroyer they faced represented not just a ship, but the weight of factories producing weapons at a tempo Japan simply could not keep up with. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, its navy was almost completely out of ammunition. Many ships were immobilized, not because they lacked fuel, but because they had nothing left to fire. America, meanwhile, still had vast reserves and production lines ready for even larger invasions that never needed to occur. In his later writings, Captain Hara did not shy away from this truth. He acknowledged that Japanese bravery, training, and tactics could never overcome America's unmatched industrial strength. While Japanese sailors conserved every shell as if it were gold, the Americans fought with an ease of supply that allowed them to fire boldly, decisively, and constantly. It was a difference that shaped every engagement, every campaign, every outcome. The Pacific War was not simply a clash of fleets. It was a clash between two nations with fundamentally different capacities for war. Japan counted every round. America counted how many rounds they could produce tomorrow, and in the end, that difference decided everything.